Hello, welcome to Once Upon a Political Time. I'm Carly Reilly. And today's episode is awesome because today we talk about a fight currently being waged between the government and Wall Street. And frankly, it's just so dang interesting. Also, the Trump administration is likely going to have to make some decisions about this fight, so it's important that we know what it's all about. Anyhow, this episode picks up where the last one left off. If you haven't watched the first part of this series, do it. But otherwise, here's a recap. This month, we're talking about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which are the two mortgage lending giants that many people blame, or at least partly blame, for the 2008 financial crisis. These have long been two of the most important companies in the American economy because they are a big part of the housing market. They are basically the reason anyone in this country was able to get a house after the Great Depression, and they have continued to be a huge part of why the middle and lower classes have been able to get houses since then. It's pretty important that we understand what these companies do and where they are today. I argued last time that far from being giants, Fannie and Freddie are really more like mortgage vampires. And I laid out some pretty compelling reasons for that if I do say so myself. So check it out. I also asked the question, Fannie and Freddie, are they more vicious blood-sucking vampires or more the Cullen family, the beloved vampiric clan from the Twilight series? Ultimately, I concluded they were Cullens. For all their flaws, Fannie and Freddie, for many decades, did serve an important mission in American life. So let's get to the fun stuff. Where we are today and the current lawsuit being waged over the government's handling of the GSEs, government-sponsored enterprises as Fannie and Freddie are called. Once again, I will be relying on insights from Bethany McLean, journalist and author of the book Shaky Ground, The Strange Saga of the U.S. Mortgage Giants, and Stin van Neurenberg, David S. Loeb Professor of Finance and the Director of the Center for Real Estate Finance Research at NYU's Stern School of Business, as well as the author of the book Guaranteed to Fail, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and the Debacle of Mortgage Finance. Once upon a political time, the housing market imploded and Fannie and Freddie started hemorrhaging money. This was a disaster because Fannie and Freddie's debt and mortgages are held by investors around the world. In fact, foreign central banks are some of the biggest investors in Fannie and Freddie. This means that if Fannie and Freddie had gone down, it would literally have had massive global ramifications and even potentially damaged relationships between the United States and other countries. That's how big and important and entwined these companies are. So, the government did in 2008, in some ways, the only thing it could do. It saved Fannie and Freddie, which made the implicit guarantee that I discussed last time quite explicit. Okay, here's what happened. The government took Fannie and Freddie into something called conservatorship in 2008. This meant that they took over control of the companies. They bought up 79.9% of the company's stock and left 20.1% to investors. This will come up again later. In return, Fannie and Freddie were required to pay the government an annual 10% dividend on all the money that Treasury had put into them. Now, this arrangement was never meant to be permanent. It was supposed to be temporary. Nobody wanted the government to be almost entirely on the hook for Fannie and Freddie for forever. And according to the terms of conservatorship, the government was responsible for preserving Fannie and Freddie's assets, with the ultimate goal being to eventually restore them to some sort of working order. So here's what's kind of weird. The government decided that Fannie and Freddie needed to take a combined total of $187 billion from the government in order to stay solvent. Now this number, $187 billion, factored in not just Fannie and Freddie's current losses, but also what the government expected their future losses would be, since people were likely going to be defaulting on mortgages for a long time to come. But of course, the government isn't clairvoyant. If they were, I'd like to think they would have prevented things like this from happening.
There's an old saying in Tennessee, I know it's in Texas, probably in Tennessee, that says, fool me once, shame on you. If fool me, we can't get fooled again.
Nobody vetted his speech on that? Nobody was around to teach him the real expression? Clearly, the government is not clairvoyant. They couldn't know what the GSE's future losses were going to be. So they guesstimated. And that guesstimation led them to the $187 billion figure. Now, what's so interesting about this is that a $187 billion loan put Fannie and Freddie's annual dividend payments to the government at $11.6 billion and $7.5 billion respectively, which it turns out is more than either company had ever made in the histories of their existences. So although the government was supposed to be responsible for saving Fannie and Freddie, they had structured their rescue in such a way as to make it seemingly impossible for the GSEs to ever really stand on their own again. It'd be like if you were drowning and the lifeguard grabbed you and lifted you out of the water, but for just long enough for you to get a couple gasps of air, and then he pushed you back under. And then he kept doing this, like making sure you didn't die, but also not actually bringing you to shore. And he'd be like, don't worry, I'm not gonna let you drown. But you're like, yeah, but this still really sucks. Like, this isn't living, this is just not dying. Basically, the government was acting like a crappy lifeguard. On top of that, the terms the government laid out for Fannie and Freddie were much harsher than those they offered to the big banks in their bailouts. This led a lot of people to feel like the government was being punitive. I asked Bethany McLean what she thought about it.
I do feel like it was punitive. I asked a senior member of the government who was involved in that decision once about that very question, and why Fannie and Freddie were saddled with the 10% dividend when the big banks got 5%. And he said, well, when you look at Fannie and Freddie's losses, they're a lot more than the big banks' loss. And this might have been around 2011 or so. And I was like, but you didn't know that at the time. You didn't know the losses were going to be more. So could you see into the future to know that the losses were going to be more? And he changed the subject. So I think it was meant to be punitive. I don't think there's any question.
Yeah, and was that an ideological thing, or sort of a punishment because of the way they treated congresspeople in the past, or is it sort of a combination of?
All mixed together in this stew of hatred for Fannie and Freddie that exists in Washington, D.C.
Stew of hatred, how D.C.'s elite stay so thin. Hungry? Don't fill up on carbs and sugar. Have a hearty helping of hatred stew. Also available in resentment and gridlock. But then the government got really shady. They went from like crappy lifeguard to Al Capone. In 2012, the miraculous happened. Fannie Mae turned a profit, and not just any profit. In the first half of 2012, Fannie Mae earned $7.8 billion in profit, over half the annual $11.6 billion payment she owed to the government that year. I said in my last episode that Fannie and Freddie were vampires, in part because they could heal faster than other non-vampires. Well, here you go. It became clear that Fannie was going to have a record high year in earnings, bringing in enough to pay off her 10% dividend and also to rebuild her own cash reserves so that she might one day stand on her own again. And it was at this precise moment that the government decided to change the rules of the game, changed the terms of conservatorship. Suddenly, they said, Fannie and Freddie didn't just have to pay a 10% dividend to the Treasury, they had to pay all their profits to the Treasury, everything the companies earned. If people thought the government's behavior had been punitive and petty before, they were at like, look what you made me do level now. And I say this lovingly, I love Taylor Swift. It's with love, all love. The government apparently didn't see it like that. I asked Bethany what they said the reasons were for this massive profit sweep.
So the justification that the government provided was that Fannie and Freddie were going to continue to lose money, and it was too much to have them paying 10% because that was going to destabilize them eventually. Because even though the government would pay, their line of credit was capped out. I can't remember what it was finally capped out at, but the argument was if they kept having losses and Fannie and Freddie kept having to draw on this, then eventually the line of credit was going to run out, and that was going to destabilize the housing market. And so the government argued, and people told me with perfectly straight faces that there was nobody thought Fannie and Freddie were going to turn profitable.
Even though in 2012, when this decision was made, Fannie and Freddie had turned profits for the past few quarters. Okay, let me summarize that for you. The government said Fannie and Freddie were going to keep losing money. Never mind the fact that they had actually for the past 6 months been making money, but okay. The government said that they were going to keep losing money. The government said that since they were going to keep losing money, the 10% dividend payment that the government had imposed on them was now too high. The 10% dividend was now too high, they said, because Fannie and Freddie were actually going to have to keep borrowing money from the Treasury in order to pay that dividend to the Treasury. You follow? That is crazy, of course, but it's also what had already been happening for the past 4 years. Fannie and Freddie had already been borrowing from Treasury to pay Treasury. Regardless, the government said that now that money merry-go-round had to stop, because if it didn't, then Fannie and Freddie would max out their line of credit with the Treasury, meaning they wouldn't be able to borrow any more money from Treasury, which would mean they would go bankrupt, which would mean that the global economy would become entirely destabilized. Everything about that is stupid. It's stupid because Fannie and Freddie were making money. Taking all their profits wasn't giving them a break on their 10% dividend like the government was sort of claiming. It was actually ratcheting up the cost of their 10% dividend by a lot. And this is where the government has started to feel a little like the mafia. Like they lent you $10 in a bar one time and now they're back to collect your firstborn child. Of course, not everyone sees it this way. Sten, for his part, actually believes the government made the right decision in this. Take a look.
And I think by bailing out Fannie and Freddie, the government took an incredible amount of risk, okay? An incredible amount of risk. I would teach, about Fannie and Freddie in my classes, and I would have this line in my class where I would say, after all the crisis, all the, when the history books of the crisis are written, all the government bailouts will be paid back except for Fannie and Freddie. Mm-hmm. Because I was 100% sure that they were never going to be able to basically generate enough money to ever pay this back. And then they had these blockbuster profit years, 2013, 2014, and before we knew it, they had nominally paid everything back, right? So I keep this spreadsheet where I calculate essentially what the rate of return is that the government earned so far on this investment in Fannie and Freddie, if you think of it as an investment. And right now it's something like 11% per year, right? So it's positive. They got the money back, so it's more than zero, and they've actually gotten more money back. They've gotten maybe 100 billion more back than they put in at this point. Take into account time value of money. It's like an 11% rate of return. Mm-hmm. Now, the real question to ask is that enough, 11% per year for the taxpayer, given the risk that we took at the time? Mm. And I think this was one of the riskiest investments you could have possibly imagined. No private investor wanted to make it, right? And so the taxpayer was kind of forced to make it. So I feel like 11% is, I don't think that's too much. You could argue, I think you could easily argue that's too little, still too little. Mm-hmm. So, it's fair. It's fair. So the last thing we should do, I think, is to kind of hand these profits back to the private sector.
That's interesting. That is interesting. And I'm partial to anyone who says things like factor in the time value of money because it tells me that they are way above my pay grade, no matter what time or value I factor. But there's something else we have to consider here. A group that has yet to receive even an 11% return. And that is the other investors, the people who own the remaining 20.1% of the companies. Remember them? Needless to say, they're none too pleased about the way all this has gone down, because to them, the government is stealing their profits. And I mean, that seems like a reasonable argument. The government only owns 80% of the companies, and yet they are claiming they are entitled to 100% of the profits. Aren't they entitled to like 80% of the profits? The investors say that the government is stealing their money. They say that the government is behaving like a dictatorship. They say that the government is in violation of the Fifth Amendment, which says, among other things, that the government can't take private property without rightfully paying for it. So in the end, they have sued the government in a lawsuit that is still ongoing. Sten, for his part, doesn't have too much sympathy for the investors. Take a look.
Well, so in my opinion, a lot of this investment, these private equity investors initially there were a lot of municipalities, and these municipalities were just holding this preferred equity because it was like the safest thing on the planet, right? And then once trouble started, the hedge funds started to pile in and essentially started to align themselves with these municipal bondholders, on the thesis that the government wouldn't wipe out these municipalities. And so they're just trying to coattail on those, on that premise. And so this was a very opportunistic investment. It's not like these investors were ever kind of really shareholders of Fannie and Freddie before. They were not. They're just there to kind of make a profit of the government.
Okay, let me jump in here. This argument I find less compelling. Yeah, the investors going after the government right now aren't a group of teddy bears. Everything Sten said about them is right. They are mostly already obscenely rich hedge fund guys trying to get more obscenely rich off the government bailout. And I understand why the most unsavory thing in the world would be a hedge fund payday at the expense of taxpayers. But I don't know, don't we have laws? You can't not pay someone what they are owed just because you don't like them, or because you'd rather keep the thing you owe them yourself. Yeah, I'm gonna take the number 5 extra mustard, but I'm not gonna pay you this round. I'm just feeling like I'd rather keep my money today. That's nuts, right? Also, the government chose not to take over 100% of these companies, to not buy out 100% of the companies in the bailout. Why? Here's Bethany.
So the government took 79.9% ownership in both companies.
And do you want to explain why they didn't take the full 100%?
Well, the story has always been they didn't want to put it on the Fannie and Freddie debt on the government balance sheet. So they left this 20.1% of stock outstanding that would later become a huge thorn in the government side, which I actually think is a delicious irony with the shareholder lawsuits.
Yeah. A delicious irony of the government's hatred stew. So it feels like the government didn't take the companies over in their entirety because it served the government balance sheet, and now they're nevertheless acting like they have the right to the companies in their entirety because that serves the government balance sheet. But again, I'll take the number 5 extra mustard, and this time throw in a couple of fries for my buddies over there at the Congressional Budget Office, and we're just not going to pay for any of this. We've gone a little overboard on spending this year, so. And yet, with all that said, it is perhaps naive to think that the government should or would treat Fannie and Freddie like any other normal private company. Fannie and Freddie have never been normal private companies. The President of the United States gets to appoint members of their board, for crying out loud. These companies are freaks. So in that way, I understand the government's argument. For years, shareholders profited hugely from the special benefits afforded to Fannie and Freddie by the government, and now the government's benefiting from it. I get that. And so far, the government has actually been winning the fight in court. In February, a court of federal judges sided with the government, saying that the government was within their rights to sweep all the GSE's profits. This decision rests on a clause written into the conservatorship agreement that essentially gives the conservator, the United States government, free rein to do whatever the hell it wants with its conservatee. The investors are currently appealing that decision, and we'll see what happens from there. But Bethany thinks there might be more at play with these court decisions than a simple matter of who's right or wrong. Take a look.
But I don't think some of the court decisions can be separated from the animus against Fannie and Freddie either. So
Really?
No, I don't. I think there's just this deep-seated hatred of the two companies, and now you've put hedge funds in bed with Fannie and Freddie. And if there's a group that people hate more than Fannie and Freddie, it might be hedge funds. And so while they might be right, and I actually think they all are right, they're two of the most detested sort of groups, widely speaking, particularly in D.C. So they don't have any friends.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it'd kind of be like if Nurse Ratched and Bellatrix Lestrange teamed up in a lawsuit. It doesn't matter if they're right. It does not matter. You killed Sirius Bellatrix. I'll see to it you never win anything ever again in your life. I hate her. But I love this lawsuit. I love this lawsuit because it has the potential to answer the age-old paradox. What happens when an unstoppable force comes up against an immovable object? In this case, you have the unstoppable force of Wall Street villains chasing profits against the immovable object of Washington bureaucracy. Who will win in the battle of everything Americans hate about America? But this raises a larger question. Even if the conservatorship were to end, which of course literally everyone thinks it should, what do we do with Fannie and Freddie? We can't just go back to the way things were. That'd be crazy. That'd be like if I went into the kitchen and put my hand on a hot stove top and got really badly burned, and the next day I walked back into the kitchen and released Fannie and Freddie from conservatorship so they could continue business as usual. Please. But it turns out things already aren't business as usual with Fannie and Freddie. Unfortunately, I don't have time for the who's and the what's of all that here, so let me just give you the two biggest changes that have occurred. First, Fannie and Freddie have dramatically reduced their portfolio business, which was arguably the riskiest aspect of what they did. Here's Sten. Where is their portfolio at today? Do you know? I was trying to look this up.
Yes, so it was at 750 billion each, actually maybe more like 800 billion each in 2007. Today, it's around 300 billion each.
So that's 500 billion fewer dollars. And the plan is to reduce it even further. On top of that, Fannie and Freddie have further started mitigating their risks through something called credit risk transfers. This is super cool, and if you're a policy nerd, you should totally watch my addendum to this episode and learn more about it. But otherwise, just know it's making Fannie and Freddie safer than they were before. This has led people like Bethany to argue that it's time for Fannie and Freddie to once again leave the nest, to be allowed to rebuild up their capital reserves and be restored as private companies. Take a look.
I honestly think it's really hard to beat Fannie and Freddie, as with some reforms around them, most of which have already been enacted. But I've often used the old Winston Churchill line about Fannie and Freddie. And Winston Churchill famously said that democracy is the worst possible political system with the exception of all others. And like Fannie and Freddie are the worst possible way to run a housing market with the possible exception of everything else.
You know, like Chipotle is the worst possible fast food restaurant with the possible exception of all else. I don't even know if I actually really think that's true. I feel like, it might be true. And there's another pro Fannie and Freddie point that I want to make. It isn't so much about a change that's been implemented at the companies, so much as an endorsement of the way their business was even before. Because it turns out the losses on the mortgages that Fannie and Freddie had bought and guaranteed were a quarter of what they were for Wall Street mortgage-backed securities. This is incredibly meaningful, as it shows that Fannie and Freddie, sometimes cast, particularly by conservative ideologues, as the villains of the financial crisis, had actually been a lot smarter and safer than Wall Street. This then undermines, at least to some extent, the arguments made by the harshest critics of Fannie and Freddie, who for many years argued that Fannie and Freddie were taking incredible risks for short-term profits because they knew the taxpayer would bail them out if anything went wrong. And sure, in the end, elements of that were true. But it was even truer for Wall Street. Here's Bethany comparing the risks Fannie and Freddie took to those that Wall Street took.
And I always think about the analogy this way with Fannie and Freddie, just because they did take risks on borrowers, more so than perhaps some people might like to see. But just because you're willing to give your high school son who just got his driver's license the car to go to a movie with his girlfriend, a little bit of a risk, you're giving a high school kid a car to go to the movie with his girlfriend, is not the same as giving your son 6 beers and sending him out friends and a couple of pints of whiskey to go out on the freeway, right? They're two totally different things. And so one is what I see Fannie and Freddie doing, and the second is what I see the subprime lenders.
And that was really borne out in terms of the default rates later in 2000s, right? I mean, Fannie and Freddie's defaults were a fraction of what, the subprime defaults were.
So yeah, Fannie and Freddie let their son drive the car, but Wall Street let their son drive it drunk. Stan, for his part, agrees that Fannie and Freddie are much improved from where they were. The changes he would like to see are fairly minor, with one glaring exception. Sten wants to kill Fannie and Freddie. Sten wants to shut down these Fannie and Freddie companies and create one new, simpler company, one that actually isn't so dissimilar from the current companies. This new company would run much like Fannie and Freddie do today, but with even fewer responsibilities. Take a look.
I think the solution is shut them down, start over, and ideally this becomes a break-even operation, right?
So it's not a profitable company. It's just subsisting.
Yeah, exactly. I would think of this as like some sort of utility that is kind of, clearly tightly regulated. That has, this is not a big operation. This becomes a passive firm, right? Mm-hmm. You don't need any traders because that whole hedge fund thing is gone.
Yeah.
You just need some systems in place. This is all high tech these days, right? This is all automated. And, this can be a fairly nimble institution in my view. We have a very well-functioning mortgage market right now in the United States. I wouldn't jeopardize jeopardize the stability that we have today to come up with something radically new.
Mm-hmm. In this way, what Sten is advocating for is not so dissimilar to what Bethany describes, which honestly surprised me. I had actually expected Sten to be far more anti-GSE than he was. It made me think that maybe there really is a doable, reasonable solution to this. Nothing is easy, of course, but I had come into this issue thinking that there were no good solutions to housing finance. But that doesn't really seem to be the case. Given how unbelievably important housing finance is, and I mean it is at the center of the entire economy, this is not an issue we want to leave hanging. And what is clear is that leaving Fannie and Freddie where they are today is not the best answer. Here's Bethany discussing the risks if nothing changes.
Right.
Yeah, I'd say the risk is twofold. It's probably threefold. One is exactly that, is that there's some hiccup in the economy and the housing market, and Fannie and Freddie have to take a huge draw from taxpayers. The concurrent risk, or the follow-on risk from that, is that then there's political outrage, and the government says, oh God, we have to do something about this. And so instead of coming up with a well-thought-out solution, there's that old saying, fix the roof when the sun is shining, right? Instead of coming up with a well-thought-out solution, they just rush into something in order to satisfy the political rage about about Fannie and Freddie. And then the third sort of corollary is that because of the uncertainty surrounding Fannie and Freddie, and because they're not allowed to keep any of their profits, that their sort of functionality continues to dwindle. I mean, you had, in the era when Tim Howard was working at Fannie Mae, you had really smart people working at these companies, really smart, savvy people who could have had comparable jobs in the private market, but for, didn't want to, had to be in DC, whatever it was. And that's important because the mortgage market, housing finance has this either boring or sort of comfy ring to it, but it's anything but. Mortgage finance is one of the most brutal, competitive, risky businesses there is, and you don't want some sort of half-stripped government entity dealing with the market. You want really smart, savvy people who are trying to protect their company and trying to protect the taxpayers. So I just worry that over time, as this continues, you just sort of kill the spirit of the company.
Sten may want to kill Fannie and Freddie, but he actually wants to keep their spirit alive. Thus, it seems clear to me that at this point, action on this issue is better than no action. Which means, of course, we're at the mercy of the Trump administration. So I'm going to try something to try and get through to Trump in a language he might understand. Here it goes. Donald, there's a book, a very good book, tremendous book, called The Greatest Trade Ever Made. It wasn't about you, Donald. Good book, but not about you. It was about how John Paulson shorted the housing market and made a lot of money. It was a great trade, a great trade. But here's the thing. If the government, that's you, Donald, were to return Fannie and Freddie to the market, they would make a killing, an absolute killing, because the government owns 80% of the companies, which is now worth a lot of money, a lot. Very smart people say so, Donald, very, very smart. In fact, one very smart guy said that if the government made Fannie and Freddie public companies again, that the government would then get the title of having made the greatest trade ever made. Get it over John Paulson because of all the money they would make. That's you, Donald. You don't have the title of greatest trade ever made yet, but Donald, you could. So forget well thought out policy, Donald. Think of the title of greatest trade ever made. Think of the money, Donald, and take action on Fannie and Freddie. All right, that's our show. Thanks so much for watching. A big, big thanks to Bethany and Stan for their time and insights. I really appreciate it. And follow me on Twitter at Carly P. Reilly. Thanks. I forgot to thank Bethany and Stan in the last one, so that's great.